We are on page 13 and we are going to be discussing sound waves. So having discussed the most common example of transverse waves, we are now going to discuss the most popular longitudinal wave, which is sound. What is sound? Sound is a series of compression and rarefaction waves that move through the air or other materials. So the word compression might be clear. The word compression, even if we take the meaning from the everyday sense, is referring to air that is compressed and packed together. Whereas rarefaction is the opposite. It is when there is less particles of air in a particular space. Now, to better understand how sound is made up of compressions and rarefactions, we are going to look at an animation to help us visualize sound waves. So as we can see, this is a visualization of air particles as a sound wave is moving through the air. The black dots here are representing the air particles around us. As we can see, there are parts of the wave that have a high density of particles, if we follow, and other parts that have less. If we follow the descriptions at the bottom, we see that where they are very densely packed, those are compressions, and in the middle they are rarefactions. Now, if we were to follow the wave going from left to the right, we would notice that these particles are moving left and right about the same point, or roughly the same point. As you can see, if we follow this red particle here, I'm going to keep the mouse constant so that you can notice that the red particle is only oscillating to the left and to the right of the mouse. So the mouse would be similar to what we had said before, is its mean position. Okay, so even though the particles move to the left and to the right, however, the wave moves from left completely to the right. So if you are hearing a sound that is being made somewhere else, it is the energy that is reaching your ear and you are interpreting as being sound. It is not the air particles moving from that point to your ears. These sound waves are created by the vibration of some object, like a radio loudspeaker. In truth, sound could be made by anything that is vibrating. So it could be a ruler on the edge of your desk, it could be a speaker, it could be your vocal cords in your throat, in your neck, it could be a guitar string, it could be another musical instrument, or it could simply be two materials hitting each other. The waves are detected when they cause a detector to vibrate. In our case, in the human body's case, we sense sound using our ears. The detector can also be a microphone. Your eardrum vibrates from sound waves to allow you to sense them. So deep within our ear, there is something called the eardrum. I'm sure you've heard of it. And as the sound waves are coming in this case the sound waves are coming in from the left, they cause the eardrum to vibrate. Basically, the eardrum is made up of a thin membrane. It's like a thin film, a thin material, so that when these compressions and rarefactions of air hit it, it vibrates very easily. Now, the eardrum is then connected to three very tiny bones called the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, and these translate and transmit the vibrations to the right side, where an electrical signal is generated, and it is that signal that the brain interprets as sound. Sound has the standard characteristics of any waveform, by which we mean wavelength, frequency, and amplitude. We had described wavelength as the distance between two successive similar points. So in this case, we could measure the wavelength by measuring the distance between one compression and the next. That would be the wavelength. The frequency will be how many full wave cycles, which means from the left to the right and back to the left, for example, how many full cycles happen in 1 second, and the amplitude will be how far away the particles go from the left to the right away from their mean position. That would be the amplitude. Now in case of sound, wavelength and frequency are still inversely proportional in the sense that, as we are going to see, in a specific material, sound will have a fixed speed. So the shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency, and the higher frequency means that is going to be a higher pitched note. So if I were to talk like this, I would be modifying my voice to have a lower frequency. And if I talk like this, it will have a higher frequency. Okay, so with a higher frequency, that means that the air particles are vibrating a lot more than the lower frequency. Sound is a waveform that travels through matter. Although it is commonly associated with air, sound will readily travel through many materials such as water and steel. Sound travels with different speeds in different materials. Some examples are given below. So as we can see, we generally hear sound through air, and in air, sound has a speed of 330 meters every second. However, with materials that are denser, like liquids, and even more so in solids, the speeds are much higher. If we were to compare the speed of sound in air with the speed of sound in steel, it is almost 20 times as much. It is in fact 18 times as much. So in steel, sound travels 18 times faster than it does in air, because steel is much denser than air. Now you might have experienced this. If in summer you are diving, you are snorkeling, as you are underwater, you hear a boat switch on its engine and you immediately think that that boat is extremely close to you. And you go up to the surface, and when you have a look, you notice and you realize that the boat is still relatively far away. Now this happens because our brain interprets the loudness of sound to how close or how far the object making the sound is. We have two ears. Assuming that our ears are working perfectly, then our brain compares the loudness, compares the amplitude of the sound that are coming into our ears. And it is able to detect whether the sound is coming from the left, from the right, or from in front of you, or anywhere in between. So if a sound is louder in your left ear than it is in your right ear, then obviously the object making the sound is towards your left. And if the signal coming in from the left ear is the same as the signal coming in from the right, that means it is far away from both ears by the same amount, meaning it is either directly in front of you or directly behind you. Now, as an example of this, I'm going to link an audio illusion. Okay, it's like an optical illusion, but it's based in sound, that imitates going to a hairdresser and having your hair cut. Okay, it is very interesting, and I strongly suggest that you listen to this using headphones, because the effect is not extremely apparent when you use speakers. So if you can use earphones, you will appreciate what is happening there much better. So it's going to be called the virtual haircut. Some insulating materials absorb much of the sound waves, preventing the waves from penetrating the material. So even though sound can pass through solids, liquids, and gases, however, as sound travels through some of these materials, it gets absorbed by the material itself, causing the sound to not be able to reach the other side. An example of which are double glazed windows. We had mentioned that double glazed windows are very good for insulating your house against heat loss. Okay, so we said that if you were to heat up the room in winter, for example, having double glazed windows will prevent heat from escaping through those windows. However, double glazed windows also have the effect of reducing the sound transmission through them. So especially with houses or places that are built next to very busy roads, for example, it would be ideal to have double glazed windows to prevent too much sound from entering into the house. Now, these do not block out the sound completely, at least the common double glazed windows. If you have triple glazed, you might improve on the sound absorption capabilities. But at least they reduce it quite a lot. Because sound is the vibration of matter, it does not travel through a vacuum or in outer space. When you see movies or television shows about battles in outer space, you should only be able to see an explosion, but not hear it. A very good example of this would be if you watch any of the Star Wars movies, where you would have large battles happening in space and huge battleships shooting lasers and hearing those pew pew sounds. Apart from the obvious fact that movies like Star Wars are complete science fiction, but that would not even be possible. Because since in space there is no air, there is no atmosphere, and there is a vacuum, then sound cannot travel from one particle to the next. Because the way sound travels is by one particle pushing on the next one, which then pushes on the next, which moves the next, which moves the next, and so on. And that is how sound travels. That is how sound propagates. Let me remind you that fancy word. So in outer space or in a vacuum, it is impossible for sound to travel. The sounds are added for dramatic effect. An experiment to show that sound does not travel in a vacuum is the bell jar experiment. The electric bell is ringing, and the hammer can be clearly seen hitting the bell. As the air is removed from the vessel, the sound becomes fainter, even though the hammer can still be seen vibrating. So basically what we have here is a glass jar called a bell jar, in which there is a bell and a mechanism that works with electricity, in which as electricity passes, this hammer moves up and down and hits the bell repeatedly. This is similar to the bell used to notify us that a lesson has ended at school, for example. So as soon as the bell starts ringing, at first we start to hear it. But then this bell jar is connected to a vacuum pump. Basically what this does is it removes all of the air from the bell jar. And as more and more air is removed from the bell jar, the sound becomes fainter and fainter. But if we look at the hammer, it is still moving up and down and still hitting the bell. However, there is no sound to be heard. If we follow this link, we will be able to see somebody carrying out this experiment. So basically this is the setup. On the far left, we have the vacuum pump, which is basically a normal pump that is pulling out the air from inside of this bell jar. And in here, there is the bell which is ringing. Now, in this case, the hammer isn't visible. On the far right, we have the power supply. So let's see what happens. So as the power supply was switched on, the bell started ringing, because the power supply is only powering the bell, not the vacuum pump as well. The vacuum pump will be switched on later on from a separate switch. Now that the vacuum pump has been switched on, we are starting to hear the sound of the pump, and as the time goes by, the sound of the bell in the bell jar should start to get fainter and fainter. Now, the scientist conducting the experiment has closed off a valve at the bottom of the bell jar that prevents air from coming back in. So he has trapped all of the air out of the bell jar, and the bell jar has no air, or at least it has very little air. He will switch off the vacuum pump and then he will close off the pipe and eventually he will let the air back into the bell jar, and as soon as that happens, and we'll see what happens there. Pump is switched off. Pipe is blocked. Opening the valve. And as the air starts flowing back into the bell jar, we start hearing the bell with the original amount of volume. You have to note that in the middle of the video, after he switched off the vacuum pump and blocked off the bell jar, we could still hear some of the vibrations because the sound is traveling through the bell and the support and the bottom of the housing of the bell jar, and we are actually hearing that through the solids. And then the solids of the stand are then passing on the sound through the air. That is why we are able to hear a bit of sound, like in this instant. You could still make out the sound of the hammer hitting the bell. And once again, when the air rushes in, we start hearing the bell as we were hearing it at the beginning of the experiment.